First of all, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Bedegal people, the traditional owners of this land, and I would like to thank Peter so much for his beautiful welcome and acknowledge the traditional owners past, present and emerging. And I want to take a moment to actually say how special it is that we are meeting in this place and that we have been welcomed to meet in this place. Because to me it's akin to the Irish saying to the British, or the English rather, welcome. You are safe in our land. And sometimes I think we say these, give these acknowledgements in a way that we don't always feel really just quite how much that means. So I, for one, as a migrant, am extremely grateful to be able to stand here in this country that, notwithstanding the experience that Peter and his people have had, is one of the more successful and peaceful multicultural countries. I just have to get my phone out. Oh, just 1 second, hang on. Hey Siri, set the timer for 20 minutes. Set the timer for 20 minutes.
Okay.
Done, right. Okay. So I also would like to acknowledge some other people who are part of the reason that I'm here. Professor Ian Jacobs, thank you very much for conferring the degree on me. It's a great honour. Professor George Williams, Associate Professor David Blaser, Associate Professor Jan Breckenridge, and Professor Louise Chappell, who, frankly, where are you, Louise? Is a very big part of the reason that I'm here. I was going to prepare a speech, but I've had pretty nasty bronchitis and I just couldn't get my brain going. And that kind of makes me think really about what the whole purpose of this talk is, and that is communication. In the beginning was the Word. And at the end of last year, I had the very unpleasant experience of losing the ability to speak. Not metaphorically, literally. I was sitting at home with my friend Kristen, who's here, and I started feeling a bit odd. And she said, I think we'll take you to the doctor. Went to the doctor, and as I was there being examined, I went to speak. I opened my mouth to speak, and no words would come out. I felt like my brain had run out of petrol, and I was literally unable to get any words out. And it was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. Naturally, I was rushed off to hospital. They diagnosed a mini stroke, a TIA, and I was sent home. The next day, the same thing happened, and I was sent back to hospital. Luckily, it kept happening. That sounds very counterintuitive, but the fact that it was repeating meant that, in fact, it wasn't a stroke. And it was later diagnosed as a stress-induced migraine sans migraine, which means a migraine without migraine. The principal symptom of which was aphasia, the inability to speak. And I think until you have literally lost the ability to speak, it's hard to understand just how crucial a part of your humanity communication is. We are Homo sapiens, the wise Homo. And you may think that the title, you know already about the history of what I've done with marriage equality, and you may think that the title here refers to me being thrown to the lions in terms of the sort of coliseum that the marketplace of cyber marketplace of ideas has become. But actually, what has been thrown to the lions is communication, is language, is our ability to speak to one another in a meaningful, honest way where we can actually build trust and build and the underpinnings of society, which is, language and communication is really the absolute basis of democracy. It's the basis of civilization, and proper debate and discussion are required always. Now, there's always been people who game the system. There's always been people who lie to us. There's always been people who spin. But through the various engagements I've had with campaigns and with increasing presence on Twitter, I've noticed certain sinister trends happening. So everyone's familiar with the idea of the pylon. And normally this is interpreted as a kind of unthinking herd behaviour. But so for two things, there was marriage equality, and then more recently, some friends and I, in response to Israel Folau, when he started a GoFundMe page, some of those people are here today, when he started a GoFundMe page to raise his legal fees to support him in his case against Rugby Australia. Some of us wanted to send a message out to particularly at-risk LGBTQI youth to let them know that not everyone thinks they're going to hell. So we started an alternate, non-combative. We thought, how can we approach this in a way that is not the typical kind of Twitter war or adversarial approach to dealing with these things. And the reason we did that was because a bunch of us, 20 of us, many of whom are here, had recently come back from a trip to Israel and Palestine, organised by the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies. And it was a dual narrative trip. And it was called Give Peace a Chance. And the whole point of it was to go to both sides, to Israel and to Palestine, and to get beneath the narrative, beneath the stories of the conflict, and meet real people who are talking like proper human beings to one another without the baggage of the stories that they and their friends and families and communities have told one another since time immemorial. So it was a fascinating experience to meet these people. There's not a lot of them, to be frank. And I come from that sort of, lefty background where it's like an article of faith that, you side with the Palestinians. But really, my sort of departure from any kind of ideology occurred very young. I started out working in a women's refuge when I was 19. I was a volunteer. And I soon realised that there was a form of feminism that was a kind of linguistic tyranny and an actual tyranny. We all know the thing if you couldn't wear lipstick. Or, heaven forbid, go to McDonald's. But there was also that kind of thing of like, it was more to do with a sense of being in a club. That if you thought and spoke a certain way, that if you used words in a certain way, if you used all the key words, it was like being a Freemason. It was a signal to other people that you belonged to that club. You subscribed to those ideas unquestioningly. You accepted the articles of faith. And that, really did not sit well with me. And then shortly after that, I went to Poland. And I saw the other side of things, where it was communism that was the oppressive enemy. And so I've since then really, and probably in a lot of ways all my life, thanks to my father, had a very sensitive Eastern European ear for the sort of moods and feelings that sort of rustle through the herd. And I'm very sensitive to the ways in which language can be used to, as Czesław Miłosz says, create the captive mind. So I actually felt in the political wilderness for a very long time because I didn't really subscribe to any belief just because it was an ideology and it was handed to me. I got a reputation as being a fence sitter. No one likes a fence sitter. As one friend said, you know what happens to fence sitters? They get a cut fanny. Alrighty then. But throughout the experience of marriage equality, I learnt that I've always had a tendency towards idealism, and I thought that was the moral position. But as we worked with people from both sides of the aisle and other bits of the aisle, or whatever it is, I suppose not an aisle then, I started to realise that actually to just stay in your corner and fight your corner is not necessarily a moral position at all. It just makes you feel moral. It makes you feel good. And there were certainly people who I encountered on all sides who were, I mean, look at Warren Entsch. You know, I mean, you meet him, honestly, he's like what's the best way? An overweight Crocodile Dundee, really. He's got like a crocodile skin skin under his coffee table in his office. And such an incredible ally. I also realised as being part of a vulnerable minority that you need allies and that it is so easy, it's so much more easy to see who your enemies are than to see who your friends are. So going on this, after that experience of marriage equality, and I'll go a little bit more into that actually, that was when I really started to cop nasty trolling. But I noticed interesting things were going on with the trolling, which was that it was this strange kind of ripping apart of language, ideology, left, right. There would be piles on when I said certain words. If I mentioned climate change, this huge pile on, particularly of gun-toting men from America who don't even follow me. There'd be pile-ons of these people commenting if I said anything about climate change or gender. And I began to think that they were orchestrated. I know I'm not the first person to talk about Russian troll farms, but the whole idea of that somehow that social media might auto-correct itself, that it is a marketplace and that some invisible hand is going to come in and direct the morals and the ethics of all of us who are engaged in that marketplace, I think is very mistaken. In my experience, I noticed that there were concerted attacks at certain times, and there was also a strange thing, very strange thing going on where kind of lefty politics, assumptions were made about how left I was or wasn't, but lefty arguments were used to attack me, so that when, in response to the Israel Folau, we started up our own GoFundMe called For Love. Thanks, Kristen, who came up with that name. Kristen also came up with Foxy Moron, just FYI. So it was, we started this Folau, For Love campaign, and the idea was to raise money for children's cancer and just be this different way, after our experiences in Israel and Palestine, to go about in a non-combative way, exploring the idea of communicating. And I would have thought that starting a GoFundMe to raise funds for children with cancer would have been a good thing, but the onslaught I received after that, after announcing this GoFundMe, and we raised over like $275,000, was the most sustained and vicious attack I've ever encountered in my life. It was nasty, it was personal. There's sort of an order of things, like a lot of it's about me being fat, because I think maybe that's because there aren't laws to protect fat people. Just thinking. Just putting that forward. And I'm going to start that one. I'm going to talk to Rebel Wilson. And even though she did her degree in space law, there would be attacks on my weight, attacks on my integrity, telling me I'm not funny, all of the usual things. But there was this really strange thing, because it was a group of Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Catholic, I sort of separate the two in my head, atheist, LGBTQI, and straight people. And I would get all these attacks coming from sort of alt-right camps, accusing me of being anti-feminist because I was siding with Muslim people who, and homophobic, by the way. Oh, Marcia Langton and I both got called homophobic. That's a whole, we're going to start our own podcast, actually. And we're going to start off with the line, what's the most politically incorrect thing you've ever done in your life? And then go from there. I'll let you know when that happens. And so it was this thing, I think, I don't know if you've noticed this, but it's this strange kind of like a gumbo of kind of, left-right politics. It's all mixed in together, where they attempt to hoist you on your own petard, assuming they seem to think that they know what your petard is in order to hoist you on it. But what it struck me as was the frequency of them, the use of language, the people they were coming from, when they would happen, it wasn't just the content, it was the volume. And the intention was nothing other than to disrupt, to destroy debate and proper discussion, and to undermine and rip apart that fabric, those fine threads of communication that bond us together. I was born on the 1st of April, 12th of April. Oh my God, I don't even know. Well, I'm a fool. I'm still a bit bronchitis-y, so this could go anywhere. Probably already has. The day that Yuri Gagarin was the first man, he was a Russian cosmonaut and the first man launched into space. And he was the first human being to see the globe from the outside, to see the Earth. And he looked back and said, isn't it beautiful? How extraordinary. It's blue. Because before that time, we didn't even know what colour we were. So as that perspective is shifting, you 58 years later, and now that globe is surrounded by satellites spinning, orbiting endlessly, weaving that worldwide web of communication. And there are people in there who have agendas, who are agents, who really deliberately want to disrupt all of that. And how do you, when there's a mixture of people who are psychologically unbalanced, there are people of very different views, there are people with different levels of ability to communicate, and there are sort of malevolent actors. One of the things when they talk about non-violent communication, which sometimes, frankly, can be very boring, I feel that when you do this, one of the things they talk about in order to be able to do that effectively is that you have to know what you're feeling. Now, given that most of us, you go to the doctor's office and there's a chart there with a list of pictures of faces and that's how you're meant to identify your feelings. That's how hopeless we are. We have to have a chart to tell us what we're feeling. So whilst we have verbal skills to varying degrees, in some ways it's also, and probably almost worse, our own ignorance of what really drives us. So that when we enter into that marketplace, we're bringing with us a whole lot of drivers, a whole lot of emotions, a whole lot of feelings about things, a whole lot of preconceptions, some of which we're not even aware that we have ourselves. So I think there are several things. I think one of the first things is to actually understand yourself the best that you can, so that you know what it is that you're bringing in. What agendas are you bringing in? What prejudices? What narrative, as we learned in Israel and Palestine? And when you do that, I've found, weirdly, I started to really think about, so I kind of conducted a bit of an experiment on the weekend. It was genuine, but it was also a bit of a this would be interesting. these idiots were talking about that humour is inherently masculine. Did you see that stuff? Yeah. So I thought, there's a couple of ways I could go about this. I could write a really reasonable tweet and see what happens, or I could really stir the pot. So given that I was talking about this, I chose the latter, and I went in all guns blazing. And I said, I had to cop this shit decades ago, and how does this, and I kind of let rip, because often I can't, because they're literally, sometimes there are lives at stake. But this is just comedy, it's not that big a deal. Lots of likes. Media outlets contacted me, and it developed into a story in its own. And it's because of that old thing of, as Julie McCrossan said to me when we went to Israel and Palestine, there is no room for a nuanced discussion, because the bottom line is, with the news, if it bleeds, it leads. So when you're wanting to achieve cut-through, a very advertising term, the problem is that those kind of things are what get people's attention. Even with this, if I hadn't said thrown to the lions and been a bit dramatic about it, it possibly wouldn't resonate. And, thanks, Siri. I'm going to ignore Siri, I'm going to keep talking. But I did notice one thing happened, because, I've been famous a long time and I've got all these awards and stuff, and it's really great. But it's always that one nasty comment on Twitter that just gets stuck in your craw no matter what. And when I had that pile-on after the Israel Folau thing, and it was really vicious, and Julia Baird actually came to my defence, and Folau actually then tried to call the attack dogs off. It didn't work, but anyway. Thank you, Julia Baird, though. I had never really understood, how people sometimes kill themselves from Twitter attacks? And I'd never really gotten that until it happens to you. And it is a form of psychological warfare. And it's so intense. I had nightmares that night. And I'm a pretty, I've been in this business now for a long time. I've got a very great support system. I've got therapists, plural. So I'm someone who's very well resourced and has a lot of support and backup. I can call Lyndall if I'm having a... She kindly offered her services if I'm having a really terrible time. I've got my friends, but and also I have the pre-existing fame, so and familiarity, so people know me and they trust me. But people who are going in on their own without a reputation, without any structural support, they then can actually be ripped to shreds for the amusement of the crowd in the cyber coliseum. I'd like to say that Twitter doesn't matter, that it's just a small percentage of people, but given that the leader of the free world uses it as his only means of communicating, I think we know that it does matter. And also there's some excellent books out there talking about the fact that there are people with various all sorts of agendas who can, in extremely subtle ways, infiltrate their way into the dialogue via Facebook, via all sorts of elements of social media in a way that you can't even recognise and wouldn't even know that it's trying to persuade you. The old hidden persuaders. It's just that in a new version. But given all of that. Twitter's not going away. It can also be enormous fun. I've had some hilarious conversations with people across the globe that I've never even met and never will. Made friends with some people. And it certainly was a way that I could get out a lot of the arguments for marriage equality. Because I believe that, if someone says something, I'm like, set the record straight. Get it out there, because there's always third parties watching. But the bottom line is, it only is and only ever will be us, Homo sapiens, the talking ape, that decide and create and co-create this cyberspace. So we need to inform ourselves. We need to know who the players are. We need to know what they're doing. We need to protect one another. And we also need to lay down our arms, not be so ready to judge, listen a little bit more. And I think one of the things that's missing, I noticed, like when I got into a few sort of Twitter stoushes, I just thought, don't enter the conflict. There was someone that said to me, it was a masseuse when I was doing marriage equality, you know, wisdom can come to you from so many places. And I was like, how do I do this? How do I, you know, I would go around talking to everyone. What do I say? What am I meant to do? I know there's so much at risk here. Not just in Australia, but imagine if Australia had voted no. Imagine in Putin's Russia, where they're hunting LGBTQI people now. Imagine if Australia had voted no. Or where my family lives in Poland, where there are magazines issuing stickers saying LGBTQI free zone. To me, I knew that was, you know, that we think we're not important, but we matter within the Commonwealth. And that also would have been used as an argument by those people who really want to persecute LGBTQI people. So there was a lot at stake. And, you know, I felt very stressed. My mum was dying. It was a terrible time. And this masseuse said to me, when you speak, think of what is best for the higher good of all people in this country. And that's actually a spiritual solution. Because I've been around politics for so long, and it's about power, and it's not really about anything else, and it will provide no real, new, or interesting solutions. I think a lot of organised religion is about power also. But I think whatever that form of, what is it? It's like some kind of I don't know if you want to call it collective unconscious or whatever, but some sense of something bigger that takes you out of the conflict, that takes you out of the strife, that makes you not a player, not a purveyor, not a promoter. We met with people in Israel and Palestine who had lost loved ones, a Palestinian woman who had lost her husband, an Israeli man who had lost his daughter, a Palestinian man who had become a terrorist, and then after 10 years in prison, he taught himself to read English and Hebrew. He read Martin Luther King, and he read Nelson Mandela, and he watched Schindler's List. And that understanding the suffering of Jewish people completely, if you want to talk about start a revolution, that's the kind of revolution I'm interested in. The politics, the old stories, I just freaking don't care. I don't want to hear it, I don't want to know. Because it hasn't gotten us anywhere. You know, there were IDF soldiers who are working with ex-terrorists for peace. And as I said, they're a handful of people. But that is where all of my efforts, all of my heart, soul and mind, that's where my efforts will go into. Because that gift that we have, you know, 70,000 years ago, whatever it was, when we made that leap, and we were given the gift of language. Words are my life, and I lost them for a while, and they are so precious to me. I speak them, I write them, I coin them, you know. Got one word to say to you. Nice, different, unusual. So don't, I think the poets, you know, the cliche is the enemy. As Margaret Atwood said, war is the failure of language. So we have to be vigilant. We have to not use academic jargon even. And we have to, that's why I didn't really want to write something. I just wanted to talk with you, you know. And I want you to ask me questions, and we're quite happy to go over time. I don't care. You know, rules, schmalls, whatever. So I think I've said enough. I've gone over time. I'm enormously honoured to receive this doctorate. I always wanted to be a doctor. A brain surgeon, but you know. But what I really hope, and I've loved even thus far, all the interactions I've had with Louise and the Institute of Human Rights, and although human rights has sort of become a toxic word, hasn't it? According to the trolls. I'm really looking forward to working with this eclectic group of people, this interdisciplinary approach, to find new ways so that we can actually, I said, in the press release, I said, the Third World War has already begun, because I wanted to get, if it bleeds, it leads. So I said, Third World War has already begun. And in a sense it has, because wars begin long before they begin. They begin in our hearts, in our minds, in our ideas, in the stories that we tell one another, in the stories that we tell ourselves, in an effort to protect ourselves from imagined imminent dangers. So all of us have to be vigilant, not just about other people, but really about ourselves. And I think that we're at this amazing place in time where a lot of the foundations are starting to crack. And there's a possibility that, as that hoary old, Ernest Hemingway, oh God, my mind. And he said, and I never really appreciated it until I've written more and spoken more, how hard it is to write one true sentence. And my hope is that all of us, when we go, will question the jargon, question the received wisdoms, so that all of us can communicate and find that one true sentence. Thank you.